One depot, 60 kilometers from Moscow. Multiple secondary explosions across nearly 2 hours, tracked by satellite before Russian state media said a single word about it. By dawn, black smoke was still climbing over what open source analysts are calling a missile and ordnance storage site inside Moscow Oblast, one of the reserve depots that is supposed to sit safely behind Russia's densest air defense belt in the one part of the country the Kremlin has always promised its own people is untouchable. That is the headline you are seeing scroll past on every geopolitics feed this morning. It is not the story. The story is this. For 4 years, Russia has told its own population, its own soldiers, and frankly, half of Western Europe, that the deep interior is off limits, that Moscow's air defense umbrella, its distance from the front, its sheer size, made certain kinds of losses structurally impossible. A depot burning 60 kilometers from the Kremlin is not just a tactical win for Ukraine, it is evidence, physical, satellite-confirmed evidence, that the assumption underneath Russia's entire warfighting model is coming apart. Let me say that again because I need you to sit with it before we go any further. This is not a story about one warehouse. This is a story about what happens when a system built on the promise of depth stops being able to guarantee depth. Stay with me because by the end of this you will understand exactly why that distinction matters more than the fire itself. Let's reconstruct what we actually know, because the gap between what happened and what Russian officials are willing to admit happened is itself part of the story. Monitoring channels first picked up the glow shortly after midnight local time. Thermal imagery consistent with a large fire, followed within minutes by at least one and possibly several secondary detonations. Secondary detonations matter. They tell you the fire didn't just damage a building, it reached something designed to explode. Ordnance, propellant, stored missile components. That is not how a warehouse fire behaves. That is how a depot fire behaves. Regional officials did what regional officials in Russia almost always do in these situations. They confirmed a fire. They did not confirm a cause. They did not confirm a target. Within hours, the language had already softened from incident to isolated technical fault. The same rhetorical playbook used after strikes on fuel depots, airfields, and industrial sites going back years. Watch this very carefully because this pattern, confirm the smoke, deny the meaning, is not incompetence. It is damage control on a system that cannot afford to admit how often this is now happening. Independent geolocation, by contrast, placed the fire at a facility Western open-source trackers have flagged before as part of a logistics network supporting resupply of short- and medium-range missile systems. Ukraine's military has not, at time of recording, issued a detailed public claim, which is itself consistent with how Kyiv has handled deep strike operations for the past 2 years. Confirm late, confirm vaguely. Let the imagery do the talking. That silence is not evidence of nothing. It is evidence of discipline. There's a verification process behind a claim like this, and I want to walk you through it briefly because it matters for how much confidence you should place in what you're hearing. Open source analysts don't start with the explosion. They start with the glow, thermal satellite passes that flag heat signatures inconsistent with normal industrial activity. Then they cross-reference against known infrastructure databases, because a fire at a fertilizer plant looks nothing like a fire at an ordnance site once you know what you're looking for. Then, if you're lucky, ground-level footage circulating on regional social media gets geolocated against satellite imagery to confirm the exact coordinates. That's 3 independent layers of confirmation before anyone with credibility calls it a depot fire rather than just a fire. In this case, all 3 lined up within hours. So here's what happened in one sentence. Something inside Russia's home territory missile logistics chain burned for almost 2 hours, 60 kilometers from the capital, verified through 3 independent layers of open-source evidence, and the government's first instinct was to minimize it rather than explain it. Now let me tell you what that actually proves, because this is where the mainstream coverage stops and where the real analysis has to begin. It proves a doctrine problem, not just a defense problem. Russia inherited a Soviet logistics model built around massive, centralized storage. Fewer depots, bigger depots, deep in the interior, protected by distance rather than dispersal. For most of the 20th century, that model made sense. Depth was the defense. But depth only works as a defense when the enemy cannot reach depth. The moment a country can put a strike package 60 kilometers from your capital, centralization stops being a strength and becomes the single greatest vulnerability in the entire system. Every missile, every rocket motor, every guidance kit stacked in one place isn't efficient anymore. It's a target with a return address. Let me say that again, because it is the single most important operational fact in this entire video. Centralization was Russia's efficiency advantage for 60 years, and it has now become Russia's exposure. You cannot unlearn a logistics doctrine in 18 months. You cannot disperse decades of Soviet-era storage infrastructure overnight without massive cost, massive manpower, and massive vulnerability during the transition itself. Russia is not choosing to keep large centralized depots because it's smart. It's keeping them because moving away from them is slower and more expensive than absorbing the occasional loss. Compare that to how NATO logistics doctrine has evolved since the Cold War, deliberately dispersed, redundant, harder to find, harder to cripple with a single strike. That is not an accident. That is what you build when you assume your depots will eventually be found. Russia built the opposite system on the opposite assumption, and that assumption is now being tested in real time against an adversary that has spent 2 years building exactly the long-range strike capability needed to exploit it. History has already run this experiment once, and Russia's own history at that. Go back to the closing months of the Second World War when Allied bombing campaigns systematically targeted German fuel and ammunition storage rather than frontline units, precisely because staff planners understood that a tank with no fuel and a rifleman with no ammunition are combat losses without a single soldier being killed. Go back further to the Soviet Union's own logistics doctrine, built explicitly around masses of centralized reserve. The theory being that no single strike could ever meaningfully dent stockpiles that deep. That theory worked when the only tools capable of reaching those depots were slow, expensive, and easy to intercept. Manned bombers, requiring air superiority, Russia's adversaries didn't have. It does not work against low-cost, long-range drones and missiles produced in the thousands, launched from inside the country they're targeting. The tool changed, the doctrine didn't. That gap is what's burning right now, 60 kilometers from Moscow. Watch this very carefully, because this is the pedagogical point I most want you to walk away with. In military logistics, defense in depth only functions as a defense if depth is actually expensive for the attacker to cross. Once the cost of reaching deep targets collapses, and cheap long-range drone and missile production has collapsed exactly that cost over the past 3 years, depth stops being a shield and starts being a liability, because everything you've concentrated inside that depth is now sitting in one place, unprotected by anything except geography that no longer protects it. Here is what mainstream coverage keeps missing. They report the fire, they report the denial, they move on to the next headline. What they don't connect is that this strike did not happen in isolation. It happened inside a pattern that has been accelerating for weeks, and the pattern is the real story. Stay with me, because I want to widen the lens now, because a single depot fire on its own is a data point. A pattern of depot fires, refinery fires, and airfield fires radiating outward from Moscow's own backyard is a trend line, and trend lines are what actually decide wars. Go back 3 weeks. Drone strikes hit logistics warehouses and an oil depot in Moscow Oblast itself, Podolsk, the Sheremetyevo area, with Russian officials claiming the bulk of an alleged wave of hundreds of drones was intercepted, while independent footage showed fires burning across multiple sites regardless. Go forward to this past weekend. Strikes on the Engels Air Base, home to the strategic bombers Russia uses to launch its own long-range missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. In the same window, an oil refinery in Saratov Oblast, more than 1,000 kilometers from the border, burning after a drone attack Ukraine's own leadership confirmed. Add naval strikes on Shadow Fleet tankers and cargo vessels in the Black Sea. Add repeated hits on refineries processing millions of tons of crude a year. Now put this latest depot fire next to all of that. What you are looking at is not a series of disconnected news items. It is a single campaign with a single logic. Find the points where Russia's war economy and Russia's war machine intersect. Fuel, munitions, strategic aviation, maritime trade, and make every one of them expensive to defend. That is what a military that has learned how to fight looks like. Not one spectacular strike. a rolling multi-domain pressure campaign that never lets the Russian air defense network or the Russian defense industrial base or Russian logistics planners get a full night's sleep. Look at the geography alone. Moscow Oblast, Saratov, over 1,000 kilometers from the border. Engels, home to the very bomber fleet Russia uses to strike Ukrainian cities. Bashkortostan, deep in Russia's interior, where a refinery processing millions of tons of crude a year has already burned once this year after a drone attack regional officials claimed predictably was repelled. None of these places share a front line. None of them are near Ukrainian-held territory by any conventional measure. What they share is relevance. Each one sits at a genuine choke point in how Russia fuels, arms, and resupplies itself. That is not opportunistic targeting. That is a target list built by someone who understands the Russian war economy better than most Western defense committees do. And here's the number that should be getting more attention than it is. Moscow's own mayor has publicly acknowledged waves of hundreds of drones approaching the capital region in single nights, with local officials claiming the overwhelming majority intercepted. Even if you take that interception rate at face value, and open-source imagery consistently suggests the real figure is worse for Russia than officially claimed, a defense network absorbing hundreds of incoming drones in a single night, night after night, is not a defense network operating within its design tolerances. It is a defense network being worn down by sheer volume, one intercepted drone at a time, at a cost per interception that dwarfs the cost of the drone being intercepted. That math does not favor the side doing the intercepting. Let me say that again because this is the hidden variable almost nobody is naming out loud. The target list itself is the message. Fuel, munitions, strategic bombers, shadow fleet shipping. That is not a random assortment of soft targets. That is an economic and military attrition strategy executed with precision weapons instead of blunt force bombing campaigns, and it is working slowly enough that most Western coverage hasn't noticed the shape of it yet. Now let's talk about what this actually costs Russia beyond the smoke, because this is where the war stops being a battlefield story and becomes an economic and diplomatic one. And this is the layer that decides how long Moscow can keep absorbing nights like this one. Every depot that burns is munitions that don't reach the front on schedule. Every refinery that burns is fuel that doesn't reach Russian formations and revenue that doesn't reach the Russian treasury. Russia's war economy runs on oil exports and domestic refining capacity simultaneously. Hit the refineries, and you squeeze both the war chest and the war machine at the same time. That is not incidental damage. That is the entire logic of an economic pressure campaign layered underneath a military one. Watch this very carefully because here is the part that connects the battlefield to the boardroom. Western sanctions have spent 3 years trying to choke off Russian oil revenue through price caps and shadow fleet restrictions, with mixed results. Plenty of tankers have simply rerouted, reflagged, or found new insurers willing to take the risk. But sanctions can only do so much when the infrastructure itself keeps functioning. What we are watching now is a second track working in parallel with sanctions, not just restricting where Russian oil can be sold, but physically reducing how much of it Russia can refine and how reliably its missile stocks get replenished. Diplomacy caps the market. Strikes cap the machine. Together, they compress Russia's options faster than either could alone. This is also reshaping the conversation inside NATO capitals, whether officials say so publicly or not. Every strike that reaches inside Russia's traditionally safe interior raises an uncomfortable question Western governments have spent years avoiding. If Ukraine can range this deep with domestically produced systems, what does that mean for the long-running debate over Western-supplied long-range weapons and the restrictions still placed on their use? It also puts new pressure on the defense industrial side of this war. The slow, grinding push to scale up Western production of interceptors, artillery shells, and precision munitions, because a war that increasingly rewards long-range strike capability is a war that punishes whichever side runs out of the ability to build more of it faster. Let's be honest about the sanction side of this too, because it's more complicated than most coverage admits. Price caps on Russian oil exports have had real effect, but Russia adapted faster than many Western planners expected. A shadow fleet of aging, opaquely insured tankers has kept crude moving, reflagging, and rerouting around restrictions well enough to keep export revenue flowing at levels that surprise sanctions architects. That is precisely why the shift toward physically targeting refining capacity and the shadow fleet itself, tankers struck at sea rather than sanctioned on paper, matters so much strategically. You cannot reflag a burned depot. You cannot reroute a refinery that's on fire. Financial pressure is reversible the moment enforcement slips. Physical destruction of production and storage capacity is not reversible on any timeline shorter than months, sometimes years. On the Western side, the honest picture is a production race that the West is still not clearly winning. Every one of these strikes reinforces an argument that's been building in Washington, Brussels, and Kiev simultaneously. Air defense interceptors, long-range strike systems, and artillery production all need to scale faster than current procurement timelines allow, because the war is rewarding exactly the kind of deep strike, high-volume campaign we are watching unfold in real time. Talk of licensing Ukraine to produce its own air defense missiles domestically, rather than depending entirely on allocations from Allied stockpiles, has moved from a fringe proposal to an active policy debate for exactly this reason. Whichever side scales precision production faster over the next 12 months has a real claim to be winning the deeper, quieter war beneath the daily headlines. Let me say that again, because it's the sentence I want you to remember from this entire section. This war is no longer being decided only at the front line. It is being decided in refineries, depots, shipyards, and defense industrial production schedules. And right now, more of that pressure is landing on Moscow than on Kiev. So where does this go next? Let me give you the forecast, and then let me give you the verdict. Expect the pattern to continue and expect it to widen rather than narrow. Centralized Russian depots inside the traditional safe zone will remain attractive targets precisely because Russia cannot disperse them quickly enough to remove the vulnerability. Expect continued strikes on refining capacity because the economic payoff, denying fuel and revenue simultaneously, is too high to abandon. Expect Moscow's public messaging to keep minimizing each individual incident, even as the cumulative toll becomes harder to hide from anyone actually tracking satellite imagery instead of state television. And watch the diplomatic track closely over the coming weeks. Every one of these strikes adds pressure to Western debates over deeper security guarantees, expanded production of long-range and air defense systems, and just how far Allied governments are willing to let this campaign run. Here is my verdict, and I want to be precise about it rather than dramatic. A single depot fire does not end a war. It does not by itself collapse Russian logistics, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling you a headline instead of an analysis. What it does is confirm one more time in physical and undeniable terms that the core assumption Russia built this invasion on that scale and distance would always protect it from serious cost and no longer holds. Systems don't fail all at once. They fail one exposed node at a time, until the accumulated weight of those failures changes what the system can actually do. That is exactly the trajectory we are watching. The next watch point is simple. Watch whether Russia begins visibly dispersing its remaining depot infrastructure, and watch how fast or how slowly that shift happens. If it happens quickly, that tells you Moscow has finally accepted how serious this vulnerability is. If it doesn't, that tells you the cost of change is still, for now, higher than the cost of loss, and that this will not be the last depot you and I talk about. I'll be right here to break down whatever happens next, with the same discipline. Evidence first, analysis second, no exaggeration either way. If that's the kind of breakdown you want in your feed before the mainstream coverage catches up, stay with the channel, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.